Okay guys, here's a question for you. Is the $163 eBay GT45 Turbo, the clone, the best turbo ever made? Let me know in the comments. In this video, we're going to try to figure out if that little eBay GT45 clone turbo, the one that everybody sells, heck, they even sell it on Amazon, we're going to figure out if that's the best turbo ever made. The reason I ask that is I've run it on so many different combinations. I've run it on everything from a 2.4 liter K24 A2 Honda all the way up to a 7.4 liter 454 big block Chevy. That's an increase in displacement of 200% going from the 2.4 up to the 7.4. And guess what? It's worked on every motor in between. So let's take a look at all those dyno results. I'll show you how this little GT45 eBay clone turbo did, and then we'll talk about whether or not it's the best turbo ever made. The first of our test motors for our $163 GT45 eBay special turbo was a 2.4 liter Honda motor. It was a K24 A2, a JDM version that we ran with the guys over at Skunk. Now we ran a bunch of different turbos on this, including the GT45, just try to illustrate what's happening to the boost response from these different turbos. But on the GT45, I want to show you what happened. This motor made almost, it was getting up near 300 horsepower NA, made 287, and peak torque was about 193 foot-pounds on this K24. And here's what happened when we started adding boost. Just like it always does. Boost is a wonderful thing, and as we go up and up in boost pressure with our GT45, here's what happened. So we finally got up near 12.5 or 13 pounds or so, and the thing that we can notice about this is as we were going up in boost, it continued to go up and up in power, which is what you want from a turbo. So obviously the GT45 was working well. The other thing is that's a really good indication, and you can do this with any motor, but if you take the NA power output and then multiply it by the pressure ratio, like if you multiply it by, what happens is if we have a 300 horsepower motor at 14.7 pounds of boost, it should make 600. If it's doing that, it's what we call following the formula. And if it's following the formula, you know that things are working the way that they should, that the turbo is fairly efficient, that the combination's working, that your tune is fairly spot on, that all of that stuff is working. And this particular combination is doing exactly that. So with the K24A2 and this GT45 turbo, it was working fairly well. Now, is it ideal? Probably not. I mean, if I was making a 600 horsepower motor, I probably wouldn't choose this turbo. I would choose something smaller. I would get something more responsive. You can see we didn't have full boost until around 5,500 RPM. That's kind of where we're seeing the good part of the torque curve. But still, it does work, and it works on this small K24A2 motor. So now let's find out how it works on some of the bigger motors. And we're going to step this up to basically a 4.8 liter, which is 100% gain in displacement over this over the 2.4 liter. And then we'll step it up again all the way up to a 7.4 liter, which basically is a 200% increase in the displacement of this 2.4 liter. So let's check it out. The next motor we applied our GT45 to was a 4.8 liter LS. And it's important to note, and I didn't go over this when I was talking to you about the Skunk to the K24A2 motor that we ran over there with the guys at Skunk. That was a slightly modified motor. It was a JDM K24A2 motor, originally rated around 200 horsepower. The only thing that we did to it was we didn't do anything internally to it. I didn't even change the ring gap in it. We ran it on E85. We did run it with a set of the Skunk 2 cams and their intake manifold and also valve springs. And it's important to note on all of these tests, if I don't mention it, we ran them on E85 or race gas. We did not run any of them on pump gas. And I'm not trying to go over this information so that you can duplicate these combinations. That's not what this test is about or what the video is about. It's about showing you the versatility of a turbo. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the conclusion, because even though this is about the GT45 turbo, this video could actually be about a lot of different turbos. I'm just showing you that if you add boost to any combination, good things will happen, even with this low dollar GT45 turbo. So our next combination is a 4.8 liter LS, and it's a very basic combination. It might as well be a stock short block. Although this one had a forged piston in it because we'd heard it a long time ago. But it had a forged piston, it had ring gap in it, it had a stock set of 706 heads, it had a stock truck intake manifold, it had a Brian Tooley Racing Stage 2 turbo cam in it, And then we added the GT45. I have using the stock truck manifolds and a Y pipe with wastegates on it. We ran an intercooler on it, and we ran the GT45 at various different boost levels. So here we go on the GT45. Here's 6 pounds. Here's 8 pounds. Here's 10 pounds. And as we can see, as we go up in boost, just like it should, we're just turning a manual wastegate controller. I did not have an electronic controller. I don't know if I had an electronic controller on any of these. I'd have to go back and look. But again, we're not trying to look at trying to optimize the curve or anything. I'm just showing you that when we add boost from almost any turbo, including the GT45, good things happen. So we went from 400 horsepower, 405, all the way up to 654, 655. So we picked up a ton of power at just 10 pounds of boost. And again, this had an air-to-water intercooler on it running dyno water. But the GT45 is obviously certainly capable of producing this kind of power level. And we'll find out on a couple of these other combinations how much power we can actually make, because we did basically push it to where it didn't make any more power. But this is on a 4.8 liter, and remember, that's twice the size of the K24 A2. After running the 4.8 liter, we stepped up and ran our GT45 eBay special, our DNA turbo, our low buck $163 turbo on a 5.3 liter, but this was a more powerful 5.3 than the 4.8. It was much wilder combination. It made a lot of power. It made over 500 horsepower NA, and what it took to do that was, this was a motor, a boost-ready kind of combination from the guys at Strictly Performance, and what we did was upgrade it even further. We put a set of, it had a set of ported 706 heads. They have the guys at K-Tech do the porting on those. It had basically a stock bottom end. It had Gen 4 rods, and they do a hard anodizing on a factory set of pistons. It obviously had enough ring gap. This one had a good size cam in it. It was a Summit Stage 4 cam. It was a 625, 605 lift, a 234, 247 at 50, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. It also had a fast LSXR 102 millimeter intake manifold on it. So it had heads, cam, and intake on an otherwise 5.3 liter, and it made really good power doing that. It made over 500 horsepower and a lot of torque. So this combination did very well. Let's take a look and see what happened when we installed our GT45 turbo. So here's what happened when we started adding boost. 5.3 pounds, and we're already over 600 horsepower, which is nice. Here's 6.4 pounds. 7.2, a little over 8 pounds, 9.4 pounds, and then 10.6 pounds, and we're up near 800 horsepower on this combination, which is getting close to kind of the flow limit. This is near the maximum of the power I've ever made with this GT45. We're near 800 foot-pounds of torque, 795, and we're 793 horsepower. So it's really close. You get to a point, especially as we go up in displacement on these motors, that you start having to worry about excessive back pressure on this combination, and we definitely get into that when we run this thing on the larger 454 Chevy. The back pressure is like 2.5 to 1 compared to the boost pressure, so it does get really high. So that's the other thing to consider. As you go up in the power output of the NA motor, you have to start thinking about back pressure. But this DNA turbo, this GT45 clone, near 800 horsepower, so it did really well. Having run it on a 4.8 and 5.3 LS, we actually ran it on something bigger in the LS family, and that was actually a 383. It was a stroker 5.3. What we did was bore the iron block out to 3905 and install a 4-inch stroker crank. This one had ported 706 heads. It had a fairly good sized cam in it, 232, 240 at 50. It had, for this test, it had a Victor Jr. intake manifold on it, although when we ran the turbo, we ran it fuel injected with the truck intake manifold. It had forged pistons in it and stuff, so we could turn this thing up. The reason I wanted to include this is because this is the first time I actually ran this GT45 turbo. Before that, I've been running the 76 millimeter from CX Racing all the time as kind of the go-to low-dollar turbo, and then they stepped up to this bigger GT45 style turbo. So here's what happened when we ran that bigger turbo. We had an air-to-water intercooler on it. This was run on race gas and not E85. So we ran, this was just under 7 pounds, and the power jumped up from 480 up to 614. Did 9 pounds or 9.8 pounds, almost 10 pounds. So we're up at around 720 horsepower. And then we were showing 14 pounds, which seems odd, and I kind of question the boost pressure numbers only because it would surprise me that this turbo could support that boost pressure on this displacement and this power output. I would think that the actual boost pressure would be much lower than that, but this is the first time I ran it. This was long ago. I don't know if the configuration on this GT45 actually is the same as the one that I'm running now, because this one was from CX Racing, and these other GT45s, and I used the GT45 name kind of in air quotes because that's what they called this, and that's what the other guys call their turbos. But it's not the same one that we run from DNA, but it is this GT45, and we ran on this 383. And it produced right at 803 or 804 horsepower. The torque was up fairly high at 825, and this was kind of limit. I didn't run back pressure testing on this particular combination, but I'm sure that it had to be high. But again, kind of clipped right at about the 800 horsepower number, same as the high power 5.3 that we ran on. So let's check out our next combination. To further illustrate the versatility and show that the GT45 eBay turbo doesn't just work on like high performance applications like the LS motor or the Honda K series deal, we also ran this on a 5-liter Ford, which I'm a big fan of. And this was a modified version. It was a 302. And it had blueprint as cast aluminum heads on it and a trick flow street burner intake manifold on it. It had our comp XE274 cam, the 224, 232, mid 500 lift camshaft in it. We had 80-pound injectors on it, and obviously this thing was fuel injected. And when we ran it NA, it made 386 horsepower. Peak torque check-in at 374 foot-pounds of torque, so it had a nice good torque curve. Again, kind of had a dual torque peak here. Here's what happens after we installed our single turbo, and what I did was we just ran this thing with stock exhaust manifolds. I just had the stock exhaust manifolds. We flipped them around, I think, flowed all the exhaust into my Y pipe that I use for all of these. As you'll see, I use the same Y pipe on a Buick, and I use it on a big block Chevy and on this Ford, and I also used it recently on a Cadillac. So all we did was get the exhaust flowing to that common Y pipe, and here's what happened. We ran 5.5 pounds, and everyone's going to look down here at this 3,500 number. That's basically, I didn't spend a lot of time tuning it. It was down in the tens there, so it was just way too rich there. Sometimes you have a limited amount of time. Here we raise the boost to 6.2, 7.1, and then finally the peak boost that we ran on this combination was 7.8 pounds. And we kind of stopped at the 550 horsepower and a little over 550 foot-pounds of torque. You see we had a nice flat torque curve, just like the factory one does under boost. And we could do more tuning here and get this thing to work a little bit better in this range if we leaned it out, because when you're running 10-to-1, the turbo is not very happy down there. But we had full boost there on this GT45 turbo, even at 3,500 RPM, and probably on this 5-liter, we would have full boost even at 3,000 RPM, because it's big enough and it makes enough power, especially in this modified form. We stopped here because we started getting concerned about the torque production in the factory block, but this motor's still running and still works good. So let's get to our next combo. Not only does this little GT45 clone turbo work on a Honda and an LS and obviously a 5-liter Mustang, it also works on a Buick. In fact, this was basically a stock Buick. This is the Buick 455 I got from David Freiberger, and this was run in stock trim. It had stock exhaust manifolds, it had stock heads, camshaft, intake manifold that had the iron intake manifold that had a Q-jet on it. It had basically everything stock, and what we did when we added the turbo is I used the stock exhaust manifolds, the stock cast iron exhaust manifolds, and just as I was telling you with the 5-liter Mustang, I just made tubing to direct the exhaust from the stock exhaust manifolds, and we didn't even flip them around. They were still aiming in the same orientation. We just made 180-degree bends on the exhaust and mounted the turbo up in front of the motor. So we just had all the exhaust going to the common Y pipe, mounted our GT45 up there, and ran boost through our stock 455 Buick. And in stock trim, NA, this thing made a whopping 308 horsepower, and obviously it made a lot of torque, 465 foot-pounds. And here's what happened after we added our GT45, around 7 pounds. Oh, 7.7. We didn't turn this thing up very much because this thing was all stock. We ended running basically a peak of 9 pounds where this thing made a little over 500 horsepower. I think that's what I was trying to do is, is top the 500 horsepower mark. So we went from a little over 300 to over 500. And torque, because we couldn't load the thing low enough, was 760 foot-pounds of torque with the Buick 455 at about 9 pounds of boost. So again, this GT45, even on a big motor or a stock motor or a modified motor, or a little Honda motor, it's all working fairly well. Fairly well on all these combinations. Let's check out the next one. The last motor we tested our GT45 on, or GT45 clone on, was a big block Chevy. It was a Gen 6 455. It had been modified with a mild cam and a set of dart heads and a single plane intake manifold and run NA. This combination produced 510 horsepower and 488 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we put the GT45 on. And the GT45 on this combination was not an ideal application. It produced a peak of 707 horsepower. Now we know that it will make a little more power than that, and it made 755 horsepower. And the reason that we didn't turn this thing up with a single turbo and try to make more power in this is because we had such high back pressure on this application. We had about 8.5 pounds out here at the top. We had a falling boost curve on this thing, but we had 23 or 24 pounds of back pressure in this combination. So the back pressure to boost pressure relationship was really, really skewed on this combination. It had very high back pressure, and we solved it. And the way that we solved that is actually to add a second turbo. So let's take a look and see what happened when we added a second GT45 turbo. So to cure our high back pressure blues, what we did was basically double the exhaust flow of our GT45 by adding a second GT45 turbo on our big block Chevy. And here's what happened. We've got our combination making roughly 510 horsepower on our big block. And here's what happened when we started adding boost from 2 GT45 turbos. This was at 8.8 pounds. And hey, look, it's got big power and big torque, 780 horsepower and 786 foot-pounds. Here's stepping up to about 12.5 pounds, 884 horsepower and 895 foot-pounds. And here's the final run at 16.5 pounds. We're all the way up at 1,039 and 1,028 foot-pounds. So you can see and we weren't even running it that far. We were stopping at 55 or 5,600 RPM. We're starting to get a little bit concerned about the torque production because we'd like to see this thing make peak power a little higher out on this combination. This is actually the Big Bang Gen 6 big block Chevy that we're using, but we'd like to see this thing not be over 1,000 foot-pounds for for most of the curve. We'd like to see a nice rising curve. So we've got what we were trying to do is we were making some tests on the twin GT45s to find out what we needed to do. And what we need to do is, and we've done that since, is hook up an RPM regulation to our boost controller so that we can dial in boost with RPM, and now we're able to do that. So we can put the big turbos on this thing and really kind of get it spooled up and find out how much power this big block, this 454, this Gen 6 stock bottom end motor will actually make. But obviously if you have too big of a motor and then too big for your GT45, which this 500 horsepower big block kind of is, then you can always add a second one. But it just goes to show you how versatile that little GT45 is. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, once again, I will pose the following question to you. After looking at all of the data on all of our different motors and showing you how well that this little GT45 clone turbo did, is it the best turbo ever made? I'm going to give you 5 seconds. I want you to let me know in the comments, is it the best turbo ever made? Has that been 5 seconds? I'll let you know my answer. Is it the best turbo ever made? Absolutely not. And I'll tell you why. Despite the fact that it works so well on all of these combinations ranging from a 2.4 liter to a 4.8 liter and all the way up to this 7.4 liter, the reality is for all of those applications, I probably would pick a different turbo. For the little 2.4 liter Honda, I would pick a turbo that's probably smaller and more responsive, and it will be more fun, especially on the street. For the big 7.4 liter, I would pick an even bigger turbo like a VS Racing 7875 Gen 2 that I have that works so well. We know that turbo would work much better on that combination. We know that the little 62 millimeter precision turbo that we have worked even better on the K24. So is that eBay GT45 clone turbo the best turbo ever? Absolutely not. But this video wasn't done to tell you that that's the case. I wanted to show you all the applications that we ran it on, and I didn't even show you them all. We've run it on a number of other combinations because we have that turbo, it was cheap, and I've run it on a lot of stuff just because I happen to have it. But it does show you something very important, and that's the reason that I did this video. It's to show you that when you add boost from a turbo, any turbo, good things happen. If you can get all of the exhaust to the turbo and then get all the boost from that turbo into your motor, good things will happen. Even with a cheap eBay turbo like this, and I keep calling it an eBay turbo, but they sell it at other places, obviously Amazon and everywhere else out there. Everybody has this same kind of turbo because it comes from offshore and basically everybody sells it. But don't be afraid to try a turbo that might not be the absolute best turbo for your combination, because that's what we did here. We applied this turbo to a bunch of different combinations that don't make it obviously ideal, but still it works. And that's what happens if you get a turbo and put it on your combination and get all that boost to your motor. Again, good things will happen. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More turbo testing and other kinds coming up.